Today is Tuesday, January 3rd, 2017, and this is the beginning of my interview with
Donald Shears
at the
Summer Glen Grand Hall.
Summer Glen Grand Hall. My name is Sam Kwiatkowski, and I will be the interviewer. Could you please tell us your full name and address?
My name is Donald Howard Shears. I live at 1 Ocala, Florida, 34473.
Where were you born?
I was born in Rochester, New York.
How old are you today?
72.
Who were your parents and what were their occupations?
My father was Howard R. Shears. My mother was Edna Lucille Barker Shears. What was the second part? You want to know where they lived?
What did they do?
What they do? Well, my mother was a homemaker for many, many years. Only after I was probably a junior in high school did she go back to work. And she just did local stores. She ran a dry cleaning store. My father was a superintendent in a manufacturing company in Rochester. It started out as IBM prior to the war. Following the war, it was still IBM, but then he went back to work there. It was bought out by a company called Commercial Controls. Then it was bought out by a company called Frieden. Then it was bought out by a company called Singer. And when he retired, it was the first step in 1971 where they were beginning to look at computerization. And that was not something he wanted to be involved with, so he retired. And he moved to Florida. In fact, he moved to Silver Springs, Florida. And he lived there for 23 years before his death.
Wow. Do you have any siblings?
No.
What were you doing before you entered the service?
Graduating from high school.
Did you enlist or were you drafted?
I enlisted. I enlisted on a 2-year, 4-year program with the Air Force, and simply because I didn't know what I wanted to do at that point in time. And I enlisted August 30th, 1962, and got out 2 years later, and went to college on the GI Bill. But I also continued to serve in the Air Force as a reservist. And that's where I finished up after 4 years.
Why did you choose the Air Force?
I liked the uniform. My dad was a Navy man, but I didn't like the hat. You gotta be realistic, you know, when you're that young. I was only 17.
Mm-hmm.
When you're that young, you're looking for glory. What can I attract the ladies with, you know?
What was your rank?
I came out E3.
Where did you serve?
I did my basic training in Lackland Air Force Base in Texas. 8 weeks of pure inferno, because it was September, and every day the temperature went up over 100. In 1962, air conditioning was not something that was a benefit to anyone in the military. And but after basic training, I came home on leave and spent the remaining, well, almost 2 years at McGuire Air Force Base in New Jersey. And then I got out and came back home, got married, went to college, and I'm retired now. I live here.
What weapons did you qualify on during basic training?
Oh dear, weapons. 45 and M1, the two weapons that I qualified under. And I got a sharpshooter for that.
Mm.
Yep. That's because I hunted and fished all my life. My cousins and my cousin was a Marine, and my other cousin was a state trooper. And since we were old enough to hold a firearm, believe it or not, back in the 50s, we would go out every Sunday because my uncle had a farm. We would go out shooting. I was about probably 11, 12 years old, had 22. And you'd never hear about that today. But back then, BB guns, you know, I didn't watch it because I don't really care for it, but that Christmas Story movie, it comes on every Christmas, and one of the big things is he gets the BB gun, you know. They never do that today. But back then, we learned how to use the weapon and be careful with it. And but anyway, that's what we had fun doing.
Did you receive any special training?
Yes, I got special training in communications and radar. And that's what I did for about a year and a half. Was basically at the Air Force Base, worked in the tower. I probably could have come out and gone to work for the government as a air traffic controller, but that didn't really excite me. And good thing, because Reagan fired all of them. That wasn't until the 80s, though.
Do you recall your instructors?
Oh, yeah. Well, yes, the one you recall mostly is your DI, your drill instructor. And he was an okay guy, but, you know, like you see in some of the movies and what have you, they don't have any mercy on you. But they're okay. They're good guys. Yeah. John was his first name, but we never called him John. We called him Sergeant. You don't call him sir, you call him sergeant. Yeah, you only call officers sir. Yeah.
How did you adapt to military life?
Let's see, the first 3 weeks I was very homesick. But after that, you kind of got over it. Everybody had a little drift to that, particularly if you came back then, if you came from a family of a good family, where you had a good father and mother, and you had closeness with them and your friends and what have you. Everybody went through a little bit of homesick. My granddaughter did that last year when she went to college for the first time. She got homesick for the first 3 weeks. But gradually you get over it, and you move on. And that's what happened with us. You know, our squadron was pretty good. Had a lot of good times.
What do you recall about the physical regimen?
The Air Force basic training is probably, or at least back then, I'm sure it has changed considerably since then, but back then was probably pretty much comparable to all the others, with the exception of the long-term endurance that you had to go through. We had 8 weeks of basic training. I think, if I remember rightly, over the period of time, probably 3 of those weeks was spent in the classroom and learning military law, military customs, etc. And the rest of the time was spent, you know, physical education, endurance, that type of thing. But my cousin, who I said was a Marine, when we talked to each other about our basic training and so on, he went through a lot more than I did as a Marine. And but it did. It gave you a lot of good physical education, running, marching. Oh, marching. From the time you got up until the time you went to bed, you marched everywhere. Marched to KP when you had to. We actually had to go and peel potatoes, and so you marched. And you've interviewed some Marines as well, haven't you? Mm-hmm. I'm sure they gave you a pretty good insight as to what they went through. And I was fortunate. I never had to go overseas, never had to go and get involved with the Vietnam War. My brother-in-law, who is much younger than I am, he spent 2 tours in Vietnam. And so he saw a lot. He was in the Army, and he saw a lot different kind of military than what I saw. But it was good. Glad I did it.
What do you remember about the barracks?
Two-story. I became a group leader of part of the squad. I was on the first floor, had the first bunks. They were double bunks. And pretty airy. You know, they had screens on the windows. They were all open all the time in Texas. It was very warm. And I think one of the most interesting thing for some of the boys was the latrine. For some reason, none of them had to experience that kind of an environment in high school. When I went to high school, you went and I played some sports, and in gym you'd shower afterwards in an open environment. Well, the latrine was an open environment, and not every boy was accustomed to that, if you will. Cleaning the latrine. Everybody had their turn at cleaning. It was spick and span, as were the barracks, and your foot locker had to be laid out perfectly. Spit shine. It's one thing I learned how to do real good. And I took that knowledge of spit shine with me into my professional career. And my shoes always were spit shined. And actually you spit on them. That's what they call a spit shine. And the barracks were, you know, the barracks we were in were the same ones that were there prior to World War II. I think they were probably there in World War I. Well, they didn't have the Air Force in World War I or II, but it was the Army Air Corps back then. So, but it was good.
What do you remember about social life?
Oh. Well, back then everybody smoked. I shouldn't say everybody, 99% of everybody smoked. Lucky Strikes. They were nickel a pack at the commissary on base. And we had two during basic training. If you qualified at a certain level, you got 2 trips to town during the basic training. And most of them, I turned 18 when I was there. And back then you could drink when you were 18. And most of your associates and friends that you made wanted to go to town and go drinking. And go to bars and nightclubs and that kind of thing. And I didn't forego having a beer, but I wasn't into bar hopping and that kind of stuff. I was more interested in the Alamo. And because that's what my major was in high school, was a history major. And I loved history. So both the times I went to town, I went to the Alamo. I went to a bar, had a drink with 4 or 5 other guys, and then a couple of guys went with me, and we'd go to the Alamo and just tour around there and the other sites in San Antonio that you had available. I remember one incident when one of our military boys got in trouble, got stabbed, and didn't get killed, thank God, but he did get in trouble, got stabbed. I don't remember what the detail was, but it was something that they were messing around in and got in an argument with some of the locals, and next thing you know. But that was about it, really. It was nothing too major for me, anyway. It was just another vacation, as you will. I got off base. That was the nice thing about it. A weekend pass would give you all kinds of excitement.
What do you remember about the food?
The food I had to cook was good. That's all I'll say about the food. Food was okay. It wasn't bad. One of the boys that used to live here He moved back up towards Jacksonville. J.D. Cochran, he retired from the Navy. He was a chef in the Navy, and he retired from the Navy, and he was one heck of a cook. I'll put it that way. And great guy. Chief Petty Officer. Yep, he was a good guy. But the food was okay. I didn't starve to death, let's put it that way. Beans were good.
Were you part of any specific operations?
No. The operations that I was involved with up at McGuire, again, were the training, the schooling that I went through, and then just basically working at the air station. And, learning the aircraft, you learn a whole bunch of stuff, call signs, all kinds of stuff about the aircraft coming in and what you had to deal with there. And it was pretty straightforward. Nothing you couldn't handle, I'm sure. But I'm sure it's different today. Everything is computerized now. Back then it was pretty much, other than the radar and what have you, it was pretty much manual. You'd have a stack of not charts, but flip things that had every aircraft that was in the air and where they were destined to go, if they're coming back and what have you. You're constantly working that, and it was a very busy air base, but we enjoyed it, had a lot of fun.
How'd you stay in contact with your family back home?
Back then it was through letters, actually handwriting. Do you do that in school today? They teach you how to write a letter and that kind of stuff. I understand that's going away, but because of these phones and iPads and everything else. But letters, and my mother was pretty direct about me calling her once a week. So I'd call her on a Sunday. I didn't go to church every Sunday. She did, but she'd say to me, "Did you go to church?" "Oh, well, not today, Mom." That kind of. Well, then she'd give me the grief about not going to church. But so that's basically. And then when I got to leave, I would, because McGuire was only about 7 hours back to where we lived in upstate New York. So that's where my honey was. So I'd find ways to get back up there every now and then. And back then you didn't live together. Her father, being a World War II Marine, would have shot me.
What did you do for recreation when you were off duty?
Movies, played a lot of baseball when we could. In the winter, we would go to the rec hall on base, and you'd play cards, and a lot of the guys would go into town because we could go off base every weekend, and go into town and go bar hopping and that kind of stuff. But I would go off base once in a while, but mainly I would go off base when I would go home. And I tried to get home, every 4 or 5 weeks for a long weekend. And if I could get the captain to give me an extra day off, and I'd get that maybe every third or fourth time I bug him, he'd give me an extra day off, so I would have a 3-day weekend, because it took about 7.5 hours to drive home. I had a car, which really helped a great deal, and then I had some friends on base that either lived on the route or just a little off the route, and they would help pay for the gas, and so they'd come along, and I'd drop them off and then pick them up on the way back, and so that worked out pretty good. But I was more interested in getting home to my honey.
kind of friendships did you form while serving?
I had three guys that we stayed in contact with over the years. Two of them are dead now, unfortunately, and the other one lives in Minnesota. He's 76, and we stay together, or stay in contact, I should say, probably once a year, Christmas time. We exchange Christmas cards and you know, may call each other from time to time, but that's about it, really. You know, you develop a lot of acquaintances in the military, but I've developed more closeness with relationship to veterans here than actually I had when I was in. I mean, those guys that I just spoke about, they were really great guys, and we had a lot of fun together, but there's members here that we're very close to each other now, and I think a lot of it has to do with age. And as you mellow out over time and get older, there's two other Air Force, well, there's a lot of Air Force in here, but two other Air Force veterans that retired from the Air Force. They made the Air Force their career, and they're wonderful people, just wonderful. And because the Air Force was not known for what they would call a 2-2 program. It was usually 4 years of enlistment. But this program I got because I went back to college, and they paid for it, and I gave them 2 more years, but more of reserve type 2 years than being actually, you know, there on base anywhere. I'd go every 6 weeks for a weekend, and that was it. I did that for 2 years. Never fired a gun after basic training. Contrary to what a lot of my friends went through.
What did you do after leaving the service?
Well, I went back to college, worked part-time, and after I finished up school, I got a job in Rochester, New York, working for Blue Cross and Blue Shield. And I spent 4 years there, and 29 years at a place called the Genesee Hospital in Rochester, New York. It's no longer there. The hospital was closed down back in 1998. And following that, I spent 7 years at a place called Clifton Springs Hospital and Clinic. I was in administration and worked in healthcare all my life, one way or another, either on the insurance side or the medical side. And that's what I did for 42 years. Yep. 42 long years.
What are some of your most memorable experiences?
In the service? I think my one memorable experience was coming home for the first time after basic training. And you're in your uniform, you feel like you're $1,000,000, you know. You got that one stripe here, and man, you're ready to take the world on at that point in your life. You walk into your hometown where you know everybody and everybody knows you, and you know, the old ones over here, that he'll never make anything out of his life, you know. It's always those few people who figure, you know, you were the terror of the community, which I wasn't, but they always figure you were. But you walk home and, you know, you feel pretty damn good about yourself at that point. Builds self-esteem. That was the first one I can remember that was really memorable. And the second one was getting married. When I was still in the service, got married in my uniform and felt pretty good about that. I had 2 stripes at that point. So, you even feel better. And I would say probably the little bit of travel I did in the service, because when I compare it, talking with my friends here, I got some friends in here that traveled all over the world. And at that point in my life, I didn't really want to go all over the world. And but, I mean, these guys have been, you name it, and they've been there. If it wasn't Vietnam or Southeast Asia, it was Korea or Europe to Germany, or, they've been all over the place. And but those are the lifers. Those are the guys that decide to stay in. And I don't regret not staying in by any means, but I did enjoy my time. A good time. Tried to convince my grandson to do that. That isn't going to happen.
How were you received by your community when you returned home?
Oh, it was totally different than my brother-in-law, who I told you was in the Army and did 2 tours in Vietnam. I went in '62. Basically, I got out in '64, but I had 2 years reserved after that. But I was in the community at '64, and that was before Vietnam blew up. Whereas my brother-in-law, he went to Vietnam the first time '68, and '68 and '69 he was in Vietnam at the height of terror over there. And when he came home in 1970, it wasn't quite as bad as those that came home under Nixon when they shut it all down. They weren't received well because you had all the uproar here in the country, killing babies, all this and that. And, today they're held in esteem. But back then with these crazies here in this country, not unlike what we've been dealing with in this election, Donald Trump wins and you got all these crazies over here. So go figure. But I never had a problem with the service because of my time. And but my brother-in-law was not, he had a tough time, real tough time, because he was not necessarily a grunt, meaning on the front lines all the time. He was at the Da Nang Air Base there in the Army, but he was there when they got shelled and the Tet Offensive and what have you, and it was pretty terrible. And he saw death and destruction, as did many of those guys, and the folks from World War II and World War I went through. But no, I never had a major problem.
How did you adjust to civilian life once again?
Well, going to school was pretty easy. I got married. My wife worked. I worked part-time. I didn't live on campus when I went to school. I lived off campus. We had an apartment in Rochester. Bless you. And so it was, for me, it was a real easy adjustment. Never had any issue with it whatsoever.
How has your military service impacted your feelings about war?
Well, you have to remember when I went in '62, we had a lot in the world at that point in time. There were a lot of conflicts. There were, we had a police action, if you will, in Vietnam. We had the DMZ in Korea. China was still closed. the war in Europe was over, but they were still recovering over there. Even though it was 1962, they were still recovering. The United States was the leading power in the world, if you will. Russia had gotten the nuclear bomb, but they were still not up to par with the U.S. So, when I went in '62, all the guys that were in basic training with me were ready to take on the world, if you will. We had no fear. I was 17 years old. You're scared of nothing. How old are you?
Got about to turn 17.
Okay. Nothing scares you, right? You're ready to take the world on, and that's the way we felt. I think the oldest guy in our squadron in basic training was 19. So when you think about that, here are a bunch of young teenage kids, and when you think about it real serious, those are the ones that got killed in Vietnam, Korea, World War II. They were all teenagers. And, so at that point in time, you have no fear. You're ready to attack anybody. And you never thought about shooting somebody. You just thought about doing your duty as you had to do it. And that's what they drummed into you. Try to put so you didn't walk around with the fear of being shot or killed, but you were the one that would be the one doing the killing in the time of war. And that's the way you felt. Now, the real thing, I'm sure it's a whole lot different. I talked to my brother-in-law when he got out. I had friends from high school that got really beat up bad in Vietnam. And I got one friend that's dead now. But he wouldn't talk about it. He wouldn't talk about it at all. But, so anyway.
What effect did serving in the military have on your faith?
On my faith? Well, interesting you should ask. I'm the chaplain of our veterans group here. When I started back in college, I almost went into ministry. But along the way, I kind of went this way. So my faith is very strong, and it was even strong in the military. And that was due to my mother. She was the driving force, making me get up on a Sunday morning and go to Sunday school and go to church service and what have you. And that was the driving force in my family. We had two boys. The oldest boy is dead now, but we had every Sunday was Sunday school and church. And so, if anything, the military added to my faith. It didn't take away. And I've carried it over to this time now. And we do here in Summer Glen, we had 28 deaths here in the community last year. And we've had 4 already this year. And that's what happens in a retirement community. You come here to retire and to enjoy life if you can in your waning years. But one of the things that you bring with it is death. And so we've learned from the veterans group we have, whenever a veteran dies, we have a group in here called Caring Neighbors, which I'm part of, and we would put on a celebration of life here. And if they want a celebration of life, I don't know everybody in this community. There's over 2,000 people here. But if someone passes away, and it doesn't matter whether they're a veteran or not a veteran, we'll meet with that family, or I will, and see if they want a celebration. And if they do, we'll have a celebration in here. And it's almost like a church service, but not quite. Okay? And And then the group, the caring neighbors, put on coffee and tea and dessert for the family and what have you. So it's these kinds of things I've carried through my life from the military, but it's carried over particularly now in our years here. I mean, you know, at 72, you begin to look out and beyond and understand that that part of your life is coming to, at some point, a closure, and that includes death. But we have a great community here. We share a great deal. And so from a faith standpoint, the military did nothing but make it stronger.
Have you have you remained in contact or reunited with any fellow veterans besides the three of your friends?
We did over the years. I mean, going back now, in the 60s it was difficult, but in the 70s we had sort of a mini reunion, if you will, with about 15 guys. My wife and I went to Cleveland and met up with about 14 other guys that we did base training with. And it was the first time we'd seen each other since that time. But that was the last time around. My dad had the same thing when I was a little boy from World War II. He was in the Navy, and he was in the South Pacific for 2.5 years. And in 1951, they started holding reunions every 2 years. And they did that up until they were almost all dead, which ended, I think, in the 90s, early 90s was the last reunion. And so from my standpoint, that was the only one that I had, and the other three guys. But yeah, my brother-in-law has not had any contact with any of the folks he was in the military with. That was a difficult time for him. And you know, he suffered some medical problems because of that, and Agent Orange and that kind of stuff. But he's still alive, thank God, and he's doing okay.
Are you a member of any veteran organizations?
I was up in my hometown. I was a member of the American Legion, still am. I kept the membership. I haven't been there in 11, 12 years, but, you know, I joined the Legion, and but other than our Summerglen Veterans group here, I've not joined any group down here. Pretty busy, you know, being retired. Boy, you know, it's hard in the morning to get up. I mean, you had to meet you here at 10:30. I had to really get up and move this morning.
What are some life lessons you've learned in the military?
Faith, honor, and the American justice. Those are probably the basics that I've taken away from my military experience. There's no other country on the face of the planet right now other than the United States, in my book. And even the United States, I think, has been going in the wrong direction for a number of years, but it's still the only place to be. And my wife and I have traveled to quite a few places. Europe being a history buff, I'd love to go to Europe, and the history over there is just astounding. But and I love England. We've been there twice, but still, and the English people have been through a great deal, but there's still nothing like America. And we just here not too long ago went to Italy, and Italy is a beautiful country, and they suffered a great deal during World War II, but still the U.S. is the place, no question about it.
What lessons would you like to pass on to today's generation?
Well, I suspect if we had more young people like yourself willing to sacrifice what you're doing, the country would be headed in the right direction. Anyone that dedicates themselves, as you have, to work towards your Eagle Scout, because I know how hard that is. I was a Scout, never made it to Eagle. My Marine cousin did, and I know what he went through. It's a great achievement, and scouting has kind of taken, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong in this statement, but it seems like it's taken a second seat now to what it was 30 years ago. You don't have as many young people coming into scouting. Is that true or false?
No, that's true.
Yeah. And, I know times change and nothing stays the same. But if we had more people like yourself, more young people joining the scouting program, we would certainly be better off as a nation. But, I still have the faith of Jesus Christ and what he's going to do for us on this earth. I want to meet him, but no, I'm not ready yet. I mean, keep saying, hold on there, Don, But anyway, so, just have faith and, we have so many driving forces against religion today and the Christian religion that we have. And, we have atheists running around this country. You can't do this anymore. You got the terrorist group and Islam and what have you. Islam's not a religion. Okay? It's just pure and simple not a religion. It's a cult. And, if people would go in and dive into Islam and read about Islam, they'd know a lot more. It's not a religion. And the only religion is, and this is wrong to say because now I sound, prejudiced, I guess would be the right word. But, how can people not believe in our God? And look at the planet we're on. Little blue bulb floating around in what? I mean, think about it. And that's what happened. People don't want to think about it because it scares them. But anyway, you're the shining star of the future.
Is there anything I forgot to ask you about your military experience?
Well, no, not that I can think of. I made some notes here trying to remember everything, but I've told you everything. My military career was pretty simple, pretty uneventful in comparison to a lot of the guys in the group here, a lot of the folks that I know and what they did. It's way beyond what I went through. And, my cousin was a Marine, and he was in basically the same time I was, and never ended up in Vietnam. He ended up on a ship sailing all over the Caribbean as part of a Marine detachment in the Navy. And so when I asked him and his wife to go on a cruise with us, he just smiles at me and laughs. He says, I did all the cruises I'm ever going to do. He does not like to go on a ship, which you find a lot of Navy guys saying, But, no, my experience was a good experience. I think that's, and I hope most of the guys you talked with here have had the same feeling, You talked to Gary, who was a Marine. Who else did you talk to?
Oh, I don't know. I can't remember off the top of my head.
Okay. But, I would think they would have given you a pretty good experience. more so than what I did and than what they did. I mean, Gary, I think, was a nurse in the military. So, no, well, it's good luck to you.
Thank you.